I remember every bit of that day like it was yesterday. I came home from school and my sister wasn't there. On a typical day, she would get home before me, watch over me, and she'd help me with my homework. Another hour passed by and she still hadn't come home. I remember riding my bike out in the court. I remember an undercover police car that came down the street. Right away, I knew something was up. I just felt like it was going to stop at our house. It was the next day that I found out from my parents what had happened, that my sister was killed.
A truck driver's driving through Pleasanton on the freeway, looked over to his right, and saw what he felt was a person in distress or possibly harmed. He starts walking down the drainage culvert. He sees blood and realizes there's a dead body down in the creek.
I always dreaded getting a notification call like that. Somebody killed a little girl. It was a very cold crime scene. There's no weapon, there's no fingerprints, there's no footprints. Officers noticed a purse suspended in a tree above the body. They found a report card that had the name Tina Faelz on it, freshman at Foothill High School. She was stabbed 44 times.
Another thing that was noted by the coroner was that there was probably no hilt or guard on the knife because there was no marks or indentations on the body. At some point, we felt that in the course of stabbing Tina, the suspect's hand would slide off of the handle because there's no protective guard onto the blade and actually cut themselves.
There was very little to go on, so we had to rely on talking to people.
Detectives go up to Foothill High School and they start interviewing students looking for leads to follow up on. They find out that Tina was being bullied at school. She used to ride the bus home, but several girls on the bus were picking on her. They were threatening to beat her up.
Tina could no longer ride the bus. She had to go through the culvert. It was like a swamp. It felt spooky. The tunnel itself seemed like crossing into another dimension. Once you got halfway, you couldn't see anything. It was pitch black.
The day Tina was murdered, the girls that taunted Tina had thrown rocks at her.
I think that day, one of them had said, hey, let's tie Tina to a tree and stab her.
These girls were questioned. They did share that they didn't like her for whatever reason, but that particular day, the girls were actually in detention, so it wasn't possible for them to have been involved in killing Tina.
Shortly before 3 p.m., 2 students were riding in a car, Steve Carlson and Todd Smith. Carlson remarked, "Look, there's Tina Faelz," as she was headed toward the culvert.
Steve sees a male student named Jeff Michelson running through the drainage culvert that goes under I-680 right around 3 o'clock or 3:05 at the time of the murder. Jeff Michelson becomes one of the first big suspects in the case. Investigators find out that Tina's mom, Shirley, has a boyfriend who has recently moved out. His name is Keith Fitzwater. Keith moved out of the Faelz residence because he was creating some family tension in the house.
I didn't care for Keith much at all. He was 15 years younger than my mom. He was in his early 20s at the time. He had a pretty bad temper.
He started drinking heavily. He had been violent toward Shirley.
A few days prior to my sister being murdered, my sister started yelling at him to leave my mom alone. It made me feel like it could be Keith.
When detectives look into Jeff Michelson, they find out that he was known as the bully that picked on other smaller kids. According to eyewitnesses, on the day of Tina's murder, a kid named Steve Carlson was taken by Jeff and thrown into a dumpster. And they locked him in there for about 10 minutes before a teacher came and let him out. And then later, Steve Carlson sees Jeff in the general vicinity of the crime scene at the time of Tina's murder. Jeff carried a hunting-style knife in a sheath that he wore sometimes on his belt. Investigators went to interview him, and they noticed that he had a cut on his index finger.
Officers got a search warrant and went to his house. They found 2 hunting knives. The hunting knives were sent to the crime lab. They were examined for traces of blood, and they were found to be clean.
Investigators continued to look at Keith Fitzwater.
He was physically, verbally abusive. The only time he was ever nice was the night when Tina died. You know, it was unbelievably nice, and it almost seemed suspicious.
Keith asked his boss if he could get a ride from him to Shirley's house because Tina had been stabbed to death.
Detectives spoke with his boss. The one thing that they find out is that Keith had a knife on his belt at the time, which he removed and asked his boss to hold on to it.
He says, "Why do you want me to keep it?" And Keith said, "I don't want to go in the house with a knife." This certainly was suspicious behavior. You had to think something was going on. We retrieved the knife and sent it for analysis. It came back with no trace of blood.
I didn't really have anyone to fill the void after my sister passed. My mom did what she could, but she started breaking down mentally. She was in constant dismay, just wanting to know what happened. As the case gets older and older, she slowly started deteriorating just mentally. She would always have her house spotless. And whenever she'd have these breakdowns, she wouldn't clean the dishes for months. I'm seeing her deteriorate, just go crazy right in front of me.
In the 80s, there were 3 serial killers identified as murdering young girls in the Pleasanton area. One of them has to be the person responsible for Tina's death. Where do we have the best chance of finding something that maybe was overlooked before? When I'm looking at the evidence photos, there is a purse hanging from the branches of a tree. Seeing the purse up in the tree just didn't make sense to me at all. I think Tina would try and hold on to her purse and possibly try and fight back with it, using it as a weapon. It just really clicked that probably the last person to touch this purse was the suspect. I handed it over through the chain of evidence to the FBI in Quantico, Virginia. One day I get a work call, and it's the FBI. The FBI agent says to me, "Do you want to know who killed Tina Faelz?" The FBI found 4 drops of the suspect's blood on the purse. This solidified the theory that had gone back for decades, that the murderer's hand had slid down on the knife, possibly cutting himself. I wasn't ready for what I discovered. The FBI agent says, "It's Steve Carlson, the student who was locked in the dumpster." Later, after Tina's body was found, Steve was the first witness officers spoke with.
He told them that he saw a male student named Jeff Michelson in the general vicinity of the crime scene on that particular day.
He was trying to push investigators toward another suspect.
Steve was 16, Tina was 14. I just couldn't wrap my mind around the fact that a kid could kill a kid. It's just so heinous. You don't want to believe it.
Steve's parents left him alone in the house. Steve went to the school and invited other students to come over to his house and drink and use drugs. Nobody wanted to go.
And then later, some kids lock him in the dumpster. And when Steve gets out, he is covered in garbage and food, and he is pissed off.
So at that point, Steve returned home to his house and got into his mom's car and started driving around the neighborhood.
Steve tells them that Tina gives him a dirty look, like, why are you speeding through the neighborhood?
We believe that Steve got upset and at that point decided to follow Tina down into that creek. Steve's residence had a clear view of the culvert where Tina was killed. According to eyewitnesses, after the body is discovered, Steve Carlson is seen on the roof of his home watching as police begin their investigation.
We're looking into a homicide that occurred in Pleasanton in 1984 in high school. Do you remember that? You were in high school. Tina Faelz got killed. Do you remember that? Yeah. We're recontacting old cases from that case, and we. Oh yeah, oh, here we go.
Steve became violently ill.
You're under arrest for the murder of Tina Faelz.
But for Tina's mom, justice didn't come soon enough.
On the day prior to the trial, my mom had a massive heart attack.
I think she just couldn't go through the trial and died of a broken heart.
Anna Mae Florence was waiting for her sister and brother-in-law to pick her up. They were going to go for a day of shopping. Lily and Alonzo went up to her apartment. Anna started screaming inside the apartment. Anna Mae yells out to Alonzo to kick the door in. As he's getting ready to kick it, this woman comes running out. She was covered in blood when she ran from that apartment.
Alonzo had her. He had her tight. But she just slipped out of his hands.
Alonzo chased after her. It said as she was running away, she told me to get away from her or she would shoot. Alonzo came back.
And they went in there and they found her on the floor and she was bleeding quite a bit.
They found her with a cord around her neck.
She was conscious. He asked her, "Who is that?" She said she didn't know. And then she was gone.
She's been stabbed, she's been beaten, she's been murdered.
Out of all the evidence that they collected in that place, the real evidence was a single bloody print.
The fingerprint was gold in this case.
The detectives cut out a portion of the wall that had one unidentified partial print.
It made sense that this female inside the apartment just had bumped her hand along the wall enough to make the fingerprint.
DNA wasn't around yet. Fingerprints, interviews, and that's all they had.
You did have witnesses that saw a young female dressed up really nice, going door to door, asking for money. One witness had said back then it was for a funeral.
The detectives interviewed several young girls that lived in the neighborhood that fit the description. They took fingerprints, hoping to get a match to the partial print that they had got from the crime scene. At that point, they all met with negative results. There was a tip called in. This tip had some valuable information.
The day after it happened, I was over to some friend's house.
He had been at a party, and he had heard a female talking about her involvement in the homicide.
He told them that she stabbed the lady. She stabbed the lady in the neck.
Here you have somebody that calls in on their own, anonymously, with information about a homicide case.
When I heard her talking about it, then she had scratches on her hands and stuff. You know, I guess when somebody had been grabbing her, and she had a couple bruises on her arm.
You want to give us your name at this time?
No, not really.
He didn't want to give his name up because he had promised he would not say anything to anybody. The detectives tell him, you're not a suspect in this.
Okay, my name is Odell, O-D-E-L-L.
He provided his social security number and his birthday. Odell was a big lead.
I know the person that did the crime.
Okay. Do you know her name?
Yeah.
Odell said, well, the suspect was a female by the name of
Anita Campbell.
We wanted to obviously talk to Odell in person.
So would you consider helping him by wearing a wire?
Yeah.
He was gonna try to help in trapping Danita.
But then all of a sudden, he decided he didn't want to be involved. At that point, the detectives lost all contact with Odell. They were interested in tracking down Danita. A traffic stop was conducted. She was removed from the vehicle. Her prints were taken right there on the hood of her car. The detectives took the prints to the fingerprint unit, and they compared those fingerprints to that fingerprint on the wall.
There was a smear of blood on the print that was on the wall. So the quality of the fingerprint taken wasn't that good. We found some tapes.
There were 6 cassette tapes.
There was a second interview of Odell.
We turned back to the key informant from the original investigation, Odell.
Maybe on these tapes, he said something else.
Are there any other details that you can recall from that conversation?
She also said that the lady had a Social Security check.
She didn't take the check?
No, she didn't take the check on the purse.
We knew the welfare check. It was still in the purse. Only the killer would know that the victim had a welfare check in her purse.
Now, there's no way that that information had been leaked out to the public. The only reason that Odell would have known about that check being in the victim's purse is if he had been told by Danita. If we could find a better fingerprint, I could put her inside that apartment. At that time, just one print was noticed at the scene, but it was a partial fingerprint. We couldn't match that print up with Danita. There was a jar of mayonnaise sitting on the chair by the front door. Maybe Danita touched the mayonnaise jar.
And then right where the rim is, there was a fingerprint.
Let's just compare Danita's prints to that fingerprint on the mayonnaise jar. The prints did not match. We're back to square one. Why would Odell implicate Danita? Either he was in on it or he knew he was involved.
We went out to talk to him, armed with a tape recorder and the tape, and we said, Odell, we have to straighten this out.
Okay, my name is Odell.
Okay.
O-D-E-L-L.
Uh-huh.
That is you on that tape.
65 Edinburgh. That's E-D-E-N-B-U-R-G-H.
And he said, yeah, that's my address. That's my social security number. But that's not my voice.
You know, this is on tape here. You know, they recorded you back then. Who else would it be?
He said, that's not me, I'll tell you why. Yeah, that's my previous address, but the way that guy's spelling Edinburgh, I couldn't have spelled that like that. Because I can't read and I can't write. It kind of shocked me, but it hit me with, he's telling the truth. He can't read and write. This case is really weird because the informant had provided accurate information. However, the information about his own personal identity and the identity of the suspect was inaccurate.
And he gets all emotional, tearing up, crying, and he got scared. Because whoever's on this tape is providing officers with his name, his social security number.
So the next question to him is, who do you know that knows that much about you? And he listened to the tape several times and said, you know who that sounds like? My cousin Chris. Back in '87, Odell used to apply for jobs at an unemployment office. His cousin Chris would always go with him, and his cousin Chris would fill out his applications.
Back in 1987, Chris is the one who came to headquarters and saying he was Odell. The original detectives didn't look at a picture ID.
At this point, we have identified our informant and we have his real identity. So we go up to the residence. His mom answers the door. We finally are face to face with our informant. He was getting nervous. We explained to him, we're trying to find out who killed this woman. He denied anything about a tip. He denied it.
I'd have to say the turning point was his mother. She told her son, you tell them detectives what you know. Too much time's gone by, you be honest with them. There was some trembling in his voice.
He said that he did call on the tip. He does admit to knowing Danita. He said, she's innocent. Somebody else did it.
Then he told us what some other girl had told him back in 1987, the day after the homicide had taken place. He said, we were just friends. She came over and sat on my porch, and she had to tell me something. She said that she owed a drug dealer some money, and she was going door to door asking for money. Anna Mae had given her a couple dollars. She saw that there was more money in that purse. That's what took over.
This is all we need from you. We need a real name.
And he says, Zena Roberson. And he says, I've held on to this for all these years just because she was my friend. He had posed as Odell because he wanted somebody arrested for that homicide. He just didn't want Zena. And he had heard that Danita was involved in some illegal activity. Thought that, okay, she'll go to jail for this and I'll feel a lot better, you know, knowing I kept my secret with Zena. Zena was the last suspect that we had to go on. So her prints are on file.
I'm looking at these fingerprints, and I said, oh, got her. We got her, Zena.
This is the first new suspect in 26 years. We got to the Rome Police Department. So they took the picture of her, put it on their Facebook page. I don't think it was 2 minutes, they got a response. A person answered and said, this is a lady I see at the bus stop at this intersection every morning.
We get to her apartment, and I've never seen anything like it, but every pore on her body opened up. And I mean, it looked like a river coming from the top of her head all the way down. Nothing needed to be said, it was just body language.
You know, she kind of looked down. She knew, I know why you guys are here.
And I said, well, you gotta come with us.
The real element we needed was her to admit she had never been in that apartment, because we knew we had evidence putting her there.
How about this woman here? Did you know her? You ever been to her place?
You never in her apartment. You don't know who she is.
We had her in the apartment. We have 2 separate fingerprints from Zena inside Anna Mae's apartment.
She just wasn't somebody you just threw away. She was somebody to care about. And I did love her, and I still love her, and she meant a lot to the family.
2:15 a.m. in the Buckeye District of Phoenix, Arizona. Neon fractures the night. Dealers crowd darkened doorways, and pimps push their product onto street corners. In the heart of Buckeye sits the Travel Lodge Motel, an easy mark for every punk and grifter who floats by. At 2:40 a.m., two men approach the lodge. The pair is buzzed in and approaches the front desk. From a back room, the lodge's owner, 66-year-old Dale Sechrist, emerges. One of the men lays a .22 revolver across the counter and directs Sechrist to the hotel safe. Sechrist opens it and reaches in for the money, but comes out with a loaded .38. Less than 10 feet apart, Sechrist and the would-be robbers exchange gunfire. A .22 slug finds the lobby's back wall. A second hits Dale Sechrist in the chest. An hour later, Dale Sechrist is dead. 5 a.m., homicide detectives arrive at the Travel Lodge and start to process the scene. The walls are littered with slugs. The floor covered in shell casings and blood. A trail found near the front door tells police Dale Sechrist hit one of the would-be robbers before he died. This smear on a pole outside indicates the bullet wound was probably high up, near the face or neck. In the days before DNA, nothing further can be gleaned from the blood. Detectives then turn their attention to fingerprints. The lobby is full of them, pulled off doorknobs, countertops, and walls. In 1974, the process is done by hand. In 8 hours of work, an examiner can compare a single lift against about 100 print cards. The chances of finding a match, slim and none. In the case of Dale Sechrist, no match is found. Over time, the investigation into his death suffers the same fate. Fewer print cards are examined. Promising leads are run down and out. The case of Dale Sechrist's attempted robbery and murder goes cold. October 1995. The city of Phoenix, as well as its police department, has grown. Inside the homicide squad, however, Ed Reynolds' office is typical, not much larger than a broom closet. From here, he sifts through old crimes, looking for a file that may hold the clue to a killer. 22 years after Dale Sechrist was shot and killed, Ed Reynolds pulls up the Travel Lodge folder. 10 fingerprints lifted from the hotel's lobby 22 years earlier are still unidentified. Of the 10 prints, only one has enough points of identification for a run through APHIS. On October 11th, 1995, Walmsley runs Reynolds' single print through the APHIS system. In a matter of minutes, the Travel Lodge lift is compared against more than 10 million sets of prints stored in the APHIS system. That morning, Ed Reynolds gets a phone call.
Latent print examiner calls me up and says that she's identified the a latent print found on the inside of the door, the exit door that the suspects had to have exited from, to a subject by the name of Joseph Gillum.
Joseph Gillum's prints are in the APHIS system because Gillum himself is in prison, doing time for computer fraud. In 1974, Gillum lived in Phoenix, not far from the Travel Lodge. Reynolds has his first suspect. He starts with Gillum's criminal record.
All I could find is a shoplifting report where Gillum had been arrested, and his brother had been arrested for shoplifting several miles from there around that time.
Shoplifting is a long way from armed robbery, and an even longer walk from murder. Was Joe Gillum just an innocent visitor to the Travel Lodge in 1974, or did the then 16-year-old shoot it out with Dale Sechrist? Reynolds decides to pay Gillum a jailhouse visit. But first he pulls Gillum's personnel jacket. Among the items inside, a booking photo.
The first thing I noticed is I pulled his prison photos from when he was first sent to prison, and I noticed he had some unusual scars on his face.
One scar in particular, on Gillum's right cheek. It looks like it could have come from a bullet. Reynolds knows that Sechrist had managed to shoot one of his attackers. From the blood smears left at the scene, Reynolds also knows the wound was probably up high. On July 24th, Ed Reynolds meets with Gillum. As the interview unfolds, Reynolds decides to play a hunch.
I decided to go into this interview and leave him with the feeling that I already knew he committed this crime, that I already knew that one of the scars on his face was a result of this crime.
How about you? Had you ever been injured?
Yeah,
How?
I got shot.
And who shot you?
I don't know the person that shot me.
Tell me about that.
I kind of figured that's what this was about.
Reynolds' bluff works, and Gillum starts to talk.
I ride with this guy. We riding down Van Buren. We supposedly looking for girls. We pull into a motel. He turns to me and say, "Hey, you want to get a room?" I said, "Yeah." But still in my mind, I still don't know what's going on. Because we ain't picked up, talked to no girl or nothing. Next thing I know, shooting breaks out. Instead of you shooting the guy that's got the gun, you shoot me. That's how I got this. I hit the floor. Next thing I know, there's no more shooting. I get up, run out the door.
Gillum claims he never knew anyone died during the Travelodge shootout. He also contends he was not the shooter.
I was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
If you're telling me the truth, I know that you know the name of the guy that you were with.
Johnny.
Johnny what?
Riley.
Johnny Raleigh? Riley? John Riley.
Reynolds leaves with the name he needs. The man Reynolds believes may have fired the gun that killed Dale Seacrest. Now he needs to find Johnny Riley. Ed Reynolds starts his search for Johnny Riley in the criminal records archives of the Phoenix Police Department. There he finds Riley's misspent youth, a string of convictions for strong-arm theft and robbery. Of particular note, an arrest very close in time to the Travelodge shootout. Ed Reynolds next decides to pay a visit to Riley's old neighborhood.
I found his friends and the people that he associated with, and they all knew Johnny Riley as being the tough one in this group, the one that would be the guy most likely to commit an armed robbery.
Reynolds believes he may have identified his shooter. The problem is finding him. According to his friends, Riley left Phoenix in the late 1970s. At the same time, his string of arrests abruptly stopped. Ed Reynolds must now shift gears from a paper chase to a hunt through cyberspace. On the World Wide Web, there is a site called Faces of the Nation, a tracking system designed to access public records and find individuals. Reynolds uses the system to track Johnny Riley. In short order, Faces of the Nation finds Reynolds' man.
What I found was a church in Tacoma, Washington, where Johnny Riley was the pastor. A very motivating sermon that he would preach to his congregation was about the day that when he was living in sin, he and his friend Joe had done a robbery, and there was shooting involved and bullets were flying everywhere, and that God or an angel reached down and swatted the bullets away and protected him. And he used that as his profession of faith and his witness to his congregation that no matter how bad you are, that you can turn your life around.
On November 24th, 1997, Ed Reynolds sits down with Johnny Riley.
And then there's a story that some of your, I guess you call them parishioners, would tell about your testimony or your witness to your congregation about a robbery that you and this young man did back in Phoenix when you were in trouble and before you had Jesus.
Riley admits that he and Joe Gillum attempted to rob the Travelodge. Then comes the key question.
Who had the gun?
I think he handed me the gun. He had the gun, he gave me the gun. I think I had the gun.
What kind of gun did you have?
I think we had a 22.
Johnny Riley has no idea that this is a murder investigation. When he ran from that crime scene 25 years ago, he didn't think he had shot anybody. He didn't think anybody was hit with a bullet, much less went down and died.
The day after this interview, cold case detective Ed Reynolds officially informs Riley of Dale Seacrest's death and arrests him for murder. A murder Riley confessed to without ever realizing he had killed anyone.
Hello, you've reached the Arizona State Prison Complex in Yuma.
Johnny Riley now resides here in Yuma State Prison, where he is serving 10 years for second-degree murder. Joe Gillum received a similar sentence for manslaughter and does his time across state.
I think one of the last things he told me in the last interview I had with him was that if he had known 25 years earlier that he had killed that man, that he would have turned himself in 25 years ago.
Rosemary Finley is the super for an apartment complex in Reynoldsburg, Ohio. At the end of another workday, she takes the call every landlord dreads. The tenant in apartment number 9 apparently left the water on and is flooding the neighbors below.
So I pounded on the door and yelled, "Maintenance, maintenance," and nobody came to the door. So I had a master key and I unlocked the door and pushed it open, only to have it be slammed in my face.
Through the closed door, Rosemary hears a voice. She assumes it to be that of her tenant, 25-year-old Darlene Hines.
They said, "I'm sorry, but I was running the bathtub and the water ran over."
Minutes later, a maintenance man unlocks the door and catches a glimpse of what he believes to be a woman. Inside the unit's bathroom, however, he finds more than a clogged drain. Darlene Hines lay naked in the tub, her head shoved underwater, hands bound, and a telephone cord cinched around her neck. The maintenance man rushes back to the front door, then to the kitchen.
He said when I turned and came back, nobody was in the kitchen.
Detective Jim Krause is the first to arrive to Darlene's apartment. He immediately notes no sign of forced entry.
Pretty much someone she had to know, or because she would not let someone in the apartment that she did not know, according to the mother and her friends. She always looked through the peephole.
Semen recovered from the body confirms Hines was raped before she was killed. Her attacker apparently disguising his voice when the landlord came to the door, and then fleeing the scene. Around 10 p.m., Darlene Hines' cousin, Cheryl Cowens, is home in bed when the phone rings.
I really heard my mom scream, like a scream that I never heard before, and it was like, "No, oh my God, no."
Cheryl makes it to the staircase where she meets her mom.
And so she ran up the stairs, and she was screaming and screaming. And I came out the room and I said, "Mom, what's wrong? What's wrong?" And she said, "Darlene has been murdered." And I just couldn't believe what she said. And I screamed at that time, and I lost it. There was a guy following her from work.
Darlene worked as a dental hygienist at the Echo Community Health Center. The wannabe boyfriend is James Hughes, the shuttle driver at the clinic. Krause runs a check on the local and gets back a 7-year rap sheet. One that includes 2 convictions for rape. Detective Krause brings Hughes in for questioning.
Scared, broke out in a sweat. I mean, noticeably broke out in sweats.
Hughes claims he has never been to Reynoldsburg. His girlfriend, however, tells police Hughes had been in town on the day of the murder and visited a transmission repair shop.
That transmission shop is at Bryce and Main Street in the city of Reynoldsburg. And where Darlene Hines lived was at Bryce and Livingston, which was 3/4 of a mile away, but a straight shot.
Krause feels certain he has found his killer, but has no tangible evidence linking Hughes to the crime. 8 months after Darlene Hines' murder, evidence from the case is boxed up and sent to storage, also known as the deep freezer for cold cases. There it lingers for more than 2 decades. In the fall of 1999, it's business as usual inside the Reynoldsburg PD. Dispatch fielding inquiries about traffic offenses and court dates. That is, until a little after 10 a.m. on September 30th, when a woman calls in and wants to talk murder. Cheryl Cowens was 17 when her cousin Darlene was raped and killed. Now she is 38 and wants to know why the case remains unsolved.
I'm really kind of puzzled here and want to know what's going on. Why haven't they investigated? Why hadn't they opened it back up?
I said, it's an old case, and if it's about the money, getting her case open. I know a lot of ways that you can make the money to get it open.
She believed or had information that we should investigate a person known in Central Ohio as Dr. Jackson, who was a serial rapist in the late 70s, early 80s.
Edward Jackson was a cardiologist who doubled as a serial rapist, sometimes tying up his victims and leaving them in the bathtub. An MO similar to the attack on Darlene Hines.
And the more I read and the more I researched Dr. Jackson, the more I was convinced it probably was him.
Jim Krause worked the original Hines homicide investigation and believes his first suspect, another co-worker of Darlene's and two-time convicted rapist named James Hughes, is good for the murder. Investigators now have two suspects, both men who can be connected to Darlene Hines, both with a history of rape. The science of DNA will determine if either man is the killer.
We use what's called an alternate light source. We take it into a dark room, and anything, semen, saliva, certain bodily fluids will fluoresce under certain wavelengths of light.
On October 25, 1999, forensic scientist Jennifer Duval begins examining items of evidence from the Darlene Hines homicide. 1 week later, the lab has developed a partial genetic profile.
That was probably one of the biggest breaks in the case.
The next step for investigators: compare the unknown profile to blood samples obtained from two suspects. The first is Dr. Edward Jackson, a man serving 282 years for raping 36 women.
He said, "You can take all the blood you want." I didn't do it, and he said, basically, "Don't waste my time."
Denials aside, Detective Finkus remains confident Jackson is his killer. Finkus follows through, however, with the second man on his suspect list, an ex-con named James Hughes. Two decades after Darlene Hines was murdered, James Hughes has changed his name to James Martini. Little else, however, has changed. He sits down with cold case detectives and repeats the same story he told police so long ago.
I met her at her job. I used to work for a company that transported clients to her job for blood tests and stuff like that.
You wouldn't have had sexual relations with her or nothing like that?
No, I just met her.
Investigators send Martini's blood into the crime lab. 6 months later, Jennifer Duval's work is complete.
We got a match on the scarf to James Martini. The chance that someone else could have that same DNA profile was 1 in more than 7 quintillion in the African American population.
Cold case detectives slip the cuffs on Martini and charge him with murder. DNA testing, coupled with 2 prior rape convictions, appear to make the case against Martini a lock. That is, until one of the original investigators in the case, Bill Mark, is unable to testify.
Mr. Mark was the only person who was going to be able to establish a chain of custody.
The problem with the chain of custody would have been myself. Okay, at that point in time, I was recuperating from an illness and would have been unable to testify.
At the time of the murder, Mark had taken custody of the scarf on which the defendant's semen was found. Without his testimony, the scarf would most likely be inadmissible at trial.
But we suddenly had a real legal flaw. We weren't going to be able to present the relationship between this scarf, these slides, and the deceased murder victim. That would have been a total gap for this jury.
The prosecutor scrambles to do what he can to make sure that James Martini does not walk out of court a free man.
At a bare minimum, he was obstructing justice because he was lying to the police. That carries a maximum sentence of only 5 years. Getting this fellow in prison again for 5 years was far better than having him walk free.
James Martini takes the plea and is sentenced to 5 years in prison.
How could he get 5 years when he spent 22 years living a productive life? Kill her and get 5 years. It's not justice. It's not justice whatsoever.